Classic distraction technique, probably casing the place for a robbery. Officer Karen Briggs said it the way people say things they've rehearsed so many times, the words no longer require thought. Her eyes fixed on the black man across the parking lot who was loading grocery bags into the trunk of an elderly white woman's car, with the kind of unhurried patience that most people reserve for their own grandmothers. The afternoon sun had broken through after a brief rain, and the wet pavement caught the light in long silver streaks, and none of that mattered to Briggs, because she had already decided what she was looking at before she finished the sentence. Her partner, Officer Deshaun Elliott, sat in the passenger seat of the patrol car and watched the same scene, and saw something entirely different. He saw a middle-aged man in a worn navy polo shirt and khaki pants standing next to a modest 2015 Honda Civic with a small dent above the rear wheel. Well, a man who had clearly just done something kind for a stranger without being asked, a man whose body language carried none of the tension or calculation that Deshaun had learned to genuinely recognize after 2 years on the force. He saw nothing. He said nothing. The man across the lot closed the trunk, carefully exchanged a few words with the elderly woman, and the woman patted his hand with the easy warmth of someone who had just been reminded that good people still exist in the world. And then she got in her car, and he stood there for a moment watching her pull toward the exit, making sure she got out safely before he turned back toward the convenience store. Deshaun's hand moved to the radio clipped to his belt. His fingers closed around it for just a second, the way you reach for something familiar when your body knows trouble is coming before your mind has finished processing it, and then he let go and set his hand flat on his knee. Briggs was already opening her door. The man had just reached for the convenience store door handle when he heard the footsteps behind him, quick and deliberate on the wet pavement. The particular rhythm of someone who has decided the conversation is already over before it starts. And he turned with the kind of unhurried calm that belongs only to people who have been through this enough times to know exactly what comes next and have made peace with the fact that knowing doesn't make it stop happening. He took her in completely in the space of 2 seconds. Badge number 7741. Name tag, reading Briggs Platinum. Blonde hair pulled tight into a bun at the back of her head, chin elevated just slightly in the way that people use when they want to communicate authority they haven't yet earned in a given moment. Hand resting on her duty belt with the practiced ease of someone who has learned that the gesture alone is usually enough. He noted all of it the way you notice street address, not because you plan to use it, but because some part of you understands you may need it later. He kept his hands visible and his voice level and asked in 9 words or fewer whether there was a problem. There was apparently a suspicious activity report. A witness, she said, had called in a concern, and she needed to see identification, and he needed to stay exactly where he was. He asked quietly and without aggression whether he was being detained. The question landed on her like a stone on still water, and the ripple that moved across her face was not confusion, but something harder and more personal than confusion, the particular irritation of someone who resents being asked to justify themselves. He complied with the ID request. He withdrew his wallet slowly, keeping his hands visible, announced every movement before he made it. He held the license up so she could read it without taking it. She took it anyway, reached out and snatched the wallet from his hand, a violation of protocol so automatic she didn't even register doing it. The license read James Whitfield with an address in a neighborhood that made her eyes narrow before she could stop them. Deshaun had stepped halfway out of the patrol car by then, and for a moment he stood there with 1 foot on the pavement and 1 foot still inside, and his hand found the radio on his belt. Again and again. He let go, and he got back in. "Public safety," James said, when she asked what he did for a living, and he said it the same way he might have said the weather was clearing up, factual, unembellished, carrying no particular weight in his tone. She repeated it back to him with the slow, contemptuous deliberateness of someone tasting a word they've already decided is rotten. "Mall cop," she suggested. "Security guard." Something like that. She looked up from the wallet with her eyes narrowed in a way that she probably believed communicated professional skepticism, but communicated something else entirely to the small crowd of people who had begun to drift closer in the way that people do when they sense something wrong happening in a public space. James said nothing. His hands remained at his sides. Briggs stepped closer, not because she needed to be closer to conduct any legitimate investigation, but because proximity is its own kind of pressure, a way of saying I can take up the space around you and there is nothing you can do about it. And James did not step back, which visibly bothered her in a way she couldn't quite conceal. The thin gold ring on her right hand began to move a small rotating motion, unconscious, the kind of habit that lives in the fingers and surfaces only when the mind is working harder than it wants to admit. And she twisted it once, then again, then stopped herself. At the far end of the lot, the elderly woman's car was still idling near the exit. She had not left. Near the store entrance, a teenage boy had raised his phone, and the small red recording light was visible even from across the lot. And Briggs glanced at it one beat, just one, and her jaw tightened, and then she turned back to James as if she hadn't seen it, as if seeing it and continuing anyway was something she had long ago decided was acceptable. The ring twisted again. At the end of the day, she said, her voice dropping into something that was meant to be final. I wear the badge. You have nothing. James spoke then with the same quietness he had maintained throughout, no performance in it, no escalation, just a man naming what was happening with the precision of someone who has spent a long time learning that clarity. Not volume is the only thing that cuts through, and he told her that this stop had no legal basis, that the suspicious activity report she had cited did not exist, that he had been halted in a public parking lot without probable cause because of the color of his skin, and that everything she had said and done in the last several minutes had been recorded from multiple angles, including the security camera mounted above the store entrance, the phone currently held aloft by the teenager behind her, and the elderly woman who was parked at the exit with her window down and her own phone pointed steadily in their direction. Something moved through Briggs's expression that was not quite rage and not quite fear, but lived in the narrow space between them. The look of someone who has been seen clearly and cannot tolerate it. And for one moment, the ring was absolutely still on her finger, and her whole body was still. And then she reached out and grabbed his arm and spun him, and slammed him against the side of the Honda Civic with enough force that the car rocked on its tires and a new dent formed along the door panel with a sound like a flat hand striking a drum. She said, "Put your hands on the vehicle." James placed both hands flat on the roof of the car and did not resist, and did not speak, and did not move, because 30 years of experience had taught him that stillness caught on camera tells a story that nothing else can tell. Briggs wrenched his left wrist behind his back, and the metal of the handcuff closed around it, and she was already reaching for the right wrist. And Deshaun Elliott in the patrol car picked up the radio from his belt, and this time he pressed the button. From the far side of the parking lot, cutting through the entire scene with the clean authority of someone who does not raise her voice because she has never needed to, came a single command, Briggs. Hands off. Now. Captain Diane Okafor had been sitting with a cup of coffee at the diner across the street when the radio click came through dispatch. Not an emergency call, just a tone, a specific pattern that her internal affairs unit used when an officer in the field pressed the signal without speaking, the code that meant something is happening, and I need eyes here without making it worse. And she had looked through the diner window at the parking lot across the street and seen exactly enough to set the coffee cup down and walk out without paying, and cross the street at a pace that was not running but was not anything close to casual. She took in the full scene as she walked the dented car door, the half-attached handcuff visible on James Whitfield's left wrist, the teenage boy still recording the elderly woman at the exit with her window down, the small crowd of witnesses who had gone very quiet. Deshaun standing by the patrol car with his arms at his sides and his face carefully arranged into the expression of someone who has just made an irreversible decision and is still processing what that means. She took in all of it before she said a word. Briggs turned and started to speak. "Captain, this man was..." and Okafor walked past her directly to James and asked him quietly whether he was hurt. He said, "One wrist? I'm fine." She removed the half-attached handcuff herself with the same practiced efficiency of someone performing a routine task and set it on the roof of the car. Then she turned to Briggs, and the silence before she spoke was the kind of silence that fills a room even when there are no walls. The kind that makes people in the surrounding area instinctively stop moving and pay attention. And she stepped close to Briggs and said something that only Briggs could hear, and everyone watching saw the color leave Briggs's face in a single wave, starting at her forehead and moving downward like someone had turned off a light behind her eyes. The ring on Briggs's right hand twisted twice very fast, and then her hand went completely flat against her thigh and stayed there. She had stopped calculating. She had started understanding. Okafor turned to face the gathered witnesses, the elderly woman who had finally stepped out of her car, the teenage boy with the phone, 2 men from the grocery section of the lot who had been loading bags into a truck and had stopped somewhere around the time Briggs slammed James into the car door and had not started again. And she spoke clearly and without particular ceremony because the facts themselves were ceremonial enough. She said that the man standing beside the dented Honda Civic was James Whitfield, and that James Whitfield held the rank of Deputy Superintendent of the Hadley Heights Police Department, and that his appointment formally announced 3 weeks ago and effective the coming Monday placed him directly above every officer in this district, including specifically the officer who had just put a handcuff on his wrist. The parking lot went silent in the particular way that parking lots go silent when something happens that reshapes the meaning of the previous 10 minutes in a single sentence. A man near the grocery truck opened his mouth and nothing came out. The teenager lowered his phone in involuntary gesture as if the weight of what he'd just heard had traveled down his arms, and then he raised it again because some part of him understood that this was precisely the moment to keep recording. Briggs did not move. She stood with her hands at her sides and her platinum hair still tight in its bun, and her face holding the expression of someone who has just been informed that the floor they are standing on is not a floor. Deshaun, still by the patrol car, closed his eyes for exactly 1 second, then opened them. James turned from the car and faced Briggs, and the expression on his face was not the one she had been waiting for. Not anger, not the satisfaction of a man who has just watched something come around, but something quieter and in its quietness more devastating. The expression of a person looking at a situation they had hoped very much would not turn out to be what it clearly was. He spoke at a volume that the people standing nearest could hear, and no one further away needed to hear, because what he was saying was not for the audience, it was for her, and the distinction mattered to him. He said that he had not planned any of this. He had visited his mother that morning at the care facility on the east side of the city, and he had stopped to buy a bottle of water before driving home, and he had seen an elderly woman struggling with her bags, and he had helped her, because that is a thing that people do for one another, and none of it, not one single moment of the last 15 minutes, had required any of the choices she had made. He named the choices one by one, not to humiliate her, but to make sure she understood that they were choices: the fabricated report, the snatched wallet, the closing of personal space, the doubling down when the cameras were visible, the grab, the spin, the body against the car door. Every single one of them had been a fork in a road, and she had taken the worst path each time consistently without hesitation, in the way that people do when they have been taking the worst path so long they no longer recognize it as a choice at all. He said that the badge she wore was never protection. He said it was always a test, and the test had been running for every one of the 8 years she had been on the force, and the record would show how she had performed on it. He said all of this calmly, without raising his voice, without moving closer. And somehow the stillness of his delivery made each sentence land with a weight that shouting could never have achieved. Then he turned to Okafor and said in the same even tone badge, weapon, and vehicle keys effective immediately, and he wanted every complaint ever filed against Officer Karen Briggs pulled from the archives and placed on his desk by end of business. And he wanted Deshaun Elliott interviewed separately today with full protection, because the silence of a bystander is not the same as innocence, and it is also not the same as guilt, and he wanted the conversation on record. Briggs's hands were shaking visibly as she reached for the badge on her chest. She unclipped it. She held it out. One tear moved down her face, and she did not wipe it away. And James Whitfield watched her with an expression that was not satisfaction and was not mercy, but was something that existed before both of those things. A kind of bedrock sorrow for what people become when no one holds them accountable long enough. After the plainclothes officers had moved through the crowd, collecting contact information from the witnesses, and after Briggs had been escorted to the unmarked car with her badge and weapon in Okafor's hands, James walked to where Deshawn was still standing by the patrol vehicle, and Deshawn straightened instinctively and then seemed to realize the gesture was meaningless and let his shoulders drop again. James stopped beside him. Not in front of him, not facing him, just stood alongside him. The way someone stands when they are having a conversation that neither party is entirely ready to have out loud, both of them looking out at the lot where the small remaining crowd was dispersing slowly. The way people disperse after witnessing something they know they will be describing to someone else for the rest of their lives. Deshawn said, "I should have." James said, "I know." The two words landed without judgment, which somehow made them heavier than any judgment would have been. A beat passed. Then James said, "You pressed it." Deshawn looked over at him, and James was already looking at the lot. Not at Deshawn giving the younger man the privacy of not being watched in the moment the words arrived. James nodded once the small, affirming nod of a person who is filing something important away, and then he walked toward Okafor without another word. Deshawn stood alone in the space that was left, and it cost him something to stand there with what he'd done and what he hadn't done, sitting side by side like that, two things that would follow him for a long time, and it gave him something too, though he wouldn't be able to name it until later. He found one of the plainclothes officers before they left the lot, and he asked quietly where the complaint review board held its sessions. He had something to report. 3 days after the parking lot, James Whitfield sat in the office that would officially become his on Monday, surrounded by boxes that hadn't been unpacked yet, and a desk that still had the previous occupant's coffee ring on the corner, and he looked at the stack of complaint folders that his assistant had placed next to the monitor with the particular care of someone delivering something fragile. 29 folders, 8 years. A column of manila and paper that, when stacked, rose just above the height of his computer screen. He opened the first one and read it completely before moving to the second, which was not how an investigator approaches a file review, but was how a human being approaches 29 accounts of harm written by 29 people who had taken the significant and often frightening step of filing an official complaint against a police officer, which is not a thing most people do casually, because most people who have had the kinds of experiences that generate these complaints have also learned through those same experiences that the system does not tend to reward the act of speaking up. The handwriting in many of the older complaints was careful and deliberate. The kind of handwriting that happens when someone is writing something they believe matters and wants to get right. And several of them had crossed out words and small corrections in the margins. The evidence of a person choosing their language precisely wanting to be believed, trying to find the words that would make someone on the other side of a desk understand what had actually happened. 26 of the 29 complaints had been filed by Black or Hispanic residents of the district. Every single one had been dismissed. The fastest dismissal had taken 11 minutes from the time of filing. The average was under 72 hours. And 22 of the 29 dismissals carried a second signature on the closure form, not Briggs's signature, but the neat practiced signature of Lieutenant Roy Garnett, 14-year veteran of the Hadley Heights Police Department, currently assigned to the training division, where he was responsible for teaching new recruits what good policing looked like. James sat with that information for a long moment before he opened the next folder. The next name in the stack was Nadine Booker. She lived on a street of modest houses with small front yards, and the wind chimes on her porch were the kind that make a sound like someone gently clearing their throat. And she answered the door before he had quite finished knocking, which told him she had seen him coming up the walk, and had spent a moment deciding whether to answer. She was 44 years old, and she taught 8th grade English, and she looked at him with the particular careful assessment of a woman who has learned through experience to measure the intentions of people who show up at her door carrying the weight of an institution. He told her why he had come not to speak, but to listen, and not to represent the department's official position, because he did not have one yet, but to tell her that her file had been reopened, and that her name was in it exactly as she had written it, with nothing altered and nothing removed. She let him in. The complaint she had filed 3 years ago described a traffic stop on a Tuesday afternoon during a school field trip, her class of 23 eighth graders in the bus behind her car, which had been pulled over for a reason Briggs had described in her report as failure to signal a claim that the bus driver's dash cam footage, never requested by the investigating officer, would have immediately contradicted. Briggs had asked Nadine to step out of the vehicle. Briggs had placed Nadine in handcuffs on the side of the road. The entire process had taken 22 minutes, during which 23 13-year-olds had sat in a school bus and watched their teacher stand handcuffed on a public street. Nadine told the story in pieces, not because it was hard to tell, but because she was assembling it for him in the specific order she wanted him to understand it. And the order was not chronological, but emotional, the sequence of what had mattered most. What mattered most was a boy named Theo, 12 years old at the time, small for his age, quiet in the particular way of children who have learned that staying small keeps you out of trouble, who had pressed his face against the bus window and begun to cry without making any sound, and Nadine had seen him from where she stood on the road and had understood in that moment that Theo was not crying because he was surprised. He was crying because he had seen this before somewhere closer to home, and what was being confirmed for him in that moment on the side of that road was a thing he had been hoping very hard was not true, and now he knew that it was. She had filed the complaint for Theo. She said this clearly and without sentimentality. James listened without writing anything down. When she finished, he asked whether anyone had ever contacted her after the complaint was filed. She said no. He stood and thanked her, and she walked him to the door, and she asked if it would matter this time. He said, "Your name is in the record. It will not disappear again." She stood in the open doorway and watched his car until it turned the corner, and she didn't go back inside until the street was quiet. He found Calvin Reeves not through the department's contact records, but through the neighborhood itself, through the kind of word-of-mouth geography that exists in communities where people have learned not to trust official channels. Someone knew someone whose brother had been at the VFW hall on Thursday afternoons, and that was where James went, and Calvin was there at a table near the window with a cup of coffee and a newspaper he wasn't reading. He was 58 years old, broad-shouldered in the way of men who have been strong for a long time with the careful economical movements of someone who has trained himself to take up only the space he needs. He had done 3 tours, all of them in conditions that James did not ask about, and Calvin did not offer. He had come home and gotten a dog and lived quietly and bothered nobody. His complaint was 5 years old. He had been walking his dog, a Belgian Malinois named Rex, on a Tuesday evening near the park on the west side of the district, when he was stopped, ordered to the ground, and tased after he asked in a voice that witnesses described as calm why he was being stopped. When he fell, Rex had pulled toward him on the leash, and an officer had stepped on the lead to control the animal. Rex, trained to protect, had bitten the officer's boot, not through it, not breaking skin. And that night Calvin had been told that Rex had been put down as a dangerous animal. Calvin told the story the way people describe events that happened to someone they used to be, a flat informational delivery that was not detachment, but something that lived past detachment. A place you arrive after you've processed the grief so many times it no longer has new things to show you. He mentioned Rex's name once, early in the story, and did not mention it again. James told him about the reopened investigation, about the independent review board, about the 29 complaints, and what had been done with them and by whom. Calvin listened with the courtesy of a man who has learned to listen to things that may not matter while leaving the door open for the possibility that they might. Then Calvin said, "Did she ever get so much as a written warning?" James told him the truth, which was no. Calvin nodded as if he had expected nothing else and probably hadn't. When James stood to leave, he paused at the door of the VFW hall, and something in the flatness of Calvin's posture, the specific quality of a man who has rerouted his whole life around a wound that nobody official ever acknowledged, made him turn back. He said, "That changes today." He meant the investigation and the accountability and the record being corrected. Calvin heard something underneath those words, something smaller and more personal. The sound of someone finally saying what happened to you was wrong, and I am saying so clearly. And for the first time since James had sat down across from him, Calvin's posture shifted just slightly, as if something he had been holding upright for 5 years had been given permission to rest. Lieutenant Roy Garnett arrived for his interview in full uniform. He had been asked specifically to come in plain clothes. He had come in full uniform anyway, with his service ribbons aligned and his badge polished to a degree that suggested preparation, and he brought a lawyer who wore the expression of someone who had reviewed the situation and arrived at cautious optimism about the outcome. The interview room was standard pale walls. 1 table, 4 chairs, a recorder on the table between them, and Garnett took his seat with the composed ease of a man who has spent 14 years on a force where his word carried weight and his signature closed files, and who had not yet fully absorbed the fact that both of those things had just changed. The first questions were about procedure: how complaints were received, how they were logged, what the investigation process required before a dismissal could be authorized, and Garnett answered them fluently and accurately, because he knew the procedures perfectly well, having spent over a decade selectively applying them. Then the investigator placed a stack of 22 complaint forms on the table, each one bearing Garnett's signature on the dismissal line fanned out slightly, so that the signatures were all visible at once. Garnett said he had followed procedure. The investigator asked whether he had read each complaint before signing the dismissal. There was a pause, not long, but shaped the kind of pause that has a decision inside it. Garnett said yes. The investigator set a second sheet of paper on the table beside the complaints, a data analysis from the department's filing system showing the timestamp of each complaint submission and the timestamp of each dismissal under Garnett's signature. The average time between submission and dismissal was 41 minutes. The shortest was 11 minutes. The investigator said nothing further. The arithmetic was available to everyone in the room. Garnett looked at the 2 sheets of paper side by side, and then he looked at his lawyer, and his lawyer looked at the table and the specific quality of that silence, a silence that had given up pretending told James Whitfield everything about how the next phase of this investigation would go when he reviewed the transcript later that evening. No one in that room was calculating anymore. She was sitting in the holding area outside the formal hearing room when the shift changed at 4 o'clock and 2 officers from the day unit walked past in the corridor. One of them was Paula Devers, who had been Briggs's closest friend on the force for 6 years. The person she had eaten lunch with 100 times. The person she had called when her father was in the hospital. The person who knew every story about every person Briggs had ever arrested. And Paula walked past the holding area without slowing down, and without looking in, and kept walking until the sound of her footsteps disappeared around the corner. Briggs sat with that for a while. She had taken her hair down from the bun it lay loose around her shoulders, now platinum blonde in the flat institutional lighting, and she kept smoothing it back from her face, the same repetitive motion that the ring twist had been one nervous habit replacing another in the absence of the ring, which was with her other personal belongings in a plastic bag on a shelf somewhere. She was not crying. She was, if anything, still engaged in a version of the mental review that she had been running since the moment Okafor had spoken James Whitfield's title in the parking lot. A review in which she kept looking for the place where the situation had turned against her, the external factor, the thing that had happened to her that explained why she was sitting here. She found that place and she identified it as she had been identifying it in various forms for 8 years as a failure of support. The system, the culture, the people who should have backed her up and instead had left her standing alone in a parking lot with phone cameras from 3 directions and a superior officer's wrist in her handcuff. She did not think I was wrong. But she did somewhere underneath the defensive architecture arrive at something adjacent to it, a moment in which she saw James Whitfield clearly for the first time, not as a problem she had been managing, but as a person who had stood in a parking lot and been calm in a way she had never once been calm in her life. Not when she was angry, not when she was right, not even when she was certain, and the recognition of what that calm actually was, not weakness, not passivity, but the absolute absence of doubt hit her in a way she was not prepared for. She had never been certain like that. Not once. And she had been wearing a badge for 8 years. The door at the end of the corridor opened for the hearing. She stood up and smoothed her hair one more time and walked through it. The room held fewer people than the situation had generated, which was intentional. James had requested a contained proceeding. No media access, no performance, just the facts arranged in front of a panel that had read every document and needed no theater to understand what they were looking at. Deshaun Elliott testified first with full immunity, and he was thorough in a way that clearly cost him something, naming each thing he had seen and each thing he had chosen not to do about it for 18 months. Speaking in the flat, careful voice of someone who has decided that accuracy matters more than self-protection, which is a decision that is easy to describe and hard to execute. Nadine Booker read her original complaint aloud, not a summary, not a paraphrase, but the exact words she had written at her kitchen table 3 years ago after putting her own children to bed. The words she had chosen so carefully because she had wanted to be believed. And the room was very quiet while she read and remained quiet for a moment after she finished the way rooms do when something that deserved to be heard a long time ago finally gets heard. Calvin Reeves sat in the back row and did not speak because he had decided before coming that he did not need to speak, that being present was enough, that sometimes the most powerful thing is to simply exist in a room where someone is finally being held to account for something done to you, and let your presence mean what it means. Lieutenant Garnett entered a guilty plea to dereliction of duty, a negotiated reduction. His lawyer having done what lawyers do, and he would not serve prison time, but he would never hold a position of authority in any law enforcement agency again, and his name would be in the federal record, alongside the 22 files he had closed without reading, and those files would be reopened one by one. Briggs did not receive a plea offer. The panel read the findings. She was convicted on 3 counts, and the specifics of what followed the sentence, the loss of pension. The felony record landed in the room with a weight that was not dramatic but was permanent in the way that permanent things are the quiet, irreversible closing of a particular door. As she was escorted out, she passed within 4 feet of James Whitfield, who was standing near the door, and she looked at him for 1 second, and then looked away, and he did not look away, and he was not triumphant, and he was not forgiving, and he was just there. Steady, the same as he had been in the parking lot, the same as he would be tomorrow. Calvin Reeves in the back row exhaled slowly, a long breath, released from somewhere deep, and his shoulders came down a full inch, and he sat for a moment in the particular stillness of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time, and has just been allowed finally to set it down. Deshaun Elliott transferred to the training division 6 weeks after the hearing, a request he had submitted the same afternoon. He pressed the radio button in the parking lot, as if he had known in that moment that something in the direction of his life had just changed, and he needed to follow it somewhere. He stood at the front of a room with 12 new recruits on their first day, all of them young, most of them nervous, and he placed his radio on the desk in front of him without explanation, and looked at it for a moment, and then he looked up at the 12 faces looking back at him, and he said, "Before we talk about anything else, I want to talk about what it means to press this." He did not tell them the parking lot story that day. He would save it for the second week when they were ready to hear what it actually costs. 3 weeks after the hearing, Nadine Booker received an envelope in the mail with official Department of Justice letterhead, and inside was a letter stating that her complaint had been reviewed, validated, and entered permanently into the federal civil rights record. She sat at her kitchen table and read it twice, and then she folded it carefully and sealed it inside a plain white envelope and addressed it to a boy named Theo, who was now 17 and living 3 neighborhoods over, and she wrote no note with it, because no note was needed, because Theo would understand what it meant to receive a letter that said you were right to believe it mattered. The parking lot on Martin Luther King Boulevard looked the same as it always had. Wet pavement, long afternoon light. The convenience store humming quietly behind its glass doors, and an elderly woman was having trouble with her bags near her car, and a man in a navy polo shirt crossed the lot toward her without being asked, and nobody filmed it and nobody suspected anything, and she smiled when she saw him coming, and he smiled back, and that was all, and it was enough, and it was everything. If this story moved you, if you've ever watched someone do the right thing in a moment when it would have been so much easier not to share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more stories about the people who hold the line when everything around them says to let go.